So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Mark Keane. I'm an architect and a professor of architecture for the last 42 years. Today you've come hopefully to draw with me to learn more about ideas about architecture, specifically the Parthenon today in Greece. For me, it's very important to draw within the realm of architecture by hand before we get to the digital realm, because there's nothing quite as sophisticated a software program as the one that's between our ears. So hopefully you can learn things about the language of drawing as an art form, as a design tool in the course of the next hour or so for questions and answers. So we're going to start with today as a little precursor, either review or maybe it's a startup for you on the concept of drawing in perspective. So I'm going to take our subject away quickly. We'll come back to the models in a little bit. And hopefully many of you have printed out the base sheet that will help us work together in drawing the Parthenon. But first, I'd like you to pull out a quick piece of scratch paper to work with the idea of a real simple, basic tutorial on perspective. And perspective is how we see three-dimensionally, even though we've been taught some rules of science which are going to conflict with how we actually see forms in space. So it's predicated on three very simple principles. I boil this down to make it seem as bluntly easy as possible. And the first one is based off of where we are relative to our subject matter. So let's start with a drawing of us first. So right in the center of the page, just draw a very small human being. So a little tiny head, a torso, and legs. So there's some person, man, woman, child, out in space. To define that space now is the basic premise of perspective. It's all relative to where our eyes are based on what we're looking at. And that's referred to as the horizon line. And the horizon line is our eye height. So across the page now, horizontally, draw a line right through the middle of that head of our figurine there and off to the right of the paper. So right now I've established the key principle of all perspective drawing, and that's locating the HL, the horizon line, which everything must relate to. Now, to give an inference of how this works now spatially, right now we see sort of a flat image, a 2D image with a line on it. And now we're going to create space very quickly by drawing a second person. Let's assume that second person is much closer to us than the one we just drew already. So if they're much closer, and yet they're standing on the same plane as this person, their eyes will align, but the head itself becomes larger because they're closer to us, the torso is larger, and the legs are larger. So it could be the exact same person who's walked closer to us, and now on our sheet of paper, in a matter of about a minute, we've drawn a very large distance of space onto a sheet of paper. So we've created volume on a two-dimensional plane, which to a lot of people think like it's a type of magic or an illusion. And that's what perspective teaches us to do, is to create three-dimensional imagery on a two-dimensional piece of paper, canvas, drawing board, whatever you like. But we'll go over those points now. They're going to bring that space out based on the next part of our three-point device. So the second point here are VP vanishing points. And vanishing points are the idea that how we see in space is really a scientific method of how the eyes see an object and the brain absorbs that object through our retina into our cone of vision, inverts the image so we have an image in our brain of what we're looking at. So we're going to use a perfect cube because that's one of the Platonic shapes we're all very familiar with. And we can see cubic things very quickly because all sides are equal. Now, here's where it gets tricky in terms of what we know and how we have to draw contrary to what we know. You've been told since the 4th grade that these two lines, top and bottom of our square, our cube here, are parallel and they will never meet in space. So as long as they go out in cubic form, they never come down to a point. Much like the two vertical ones here and here, they will never meet in space because that's the definition of being parallel. We're going to break that rule right away here in order to convert this into a three-dimensional image, because if we don't, we're stuck with a two-dimensional plane on our paper. We want to build this cubic thing out to a form on a two-dimensional sheet of paper. So we're going to start with one key corner that's closer to us than the other two corners on either side. So by looking at this cube now, this line is physically closer than left and right. So that creates depth, just like this person is physically closer than this person, even though they're drawn on the same piece of paper. So what we're going to do to make this more architectonic is we're going to assume a certain height for the cube. It's no longer the scale of my hand. We're going to make it the size of a two-story building. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the corner of this cube and we're going to drop it down to where this person is standing. So that's about 5.5 or 6 feet tall. And now we're going to raise that up on that corner, the exact same increment, 1, 2, and 3, to create the edge of that cube, which right now is in scale as if it was a building on that ground. So now I have to take parallel lines in space and have them go back in space into the paper. And here's where the vanishing points come in, our second point. The rule is, and this rule was developed in antiquities and then lost in the Middle Ages as an actual drawing tool, and then rediscovered in the Renaissance to the point where it became theoretical and scientific, and we've held on to it ever since then as a methodology for putting 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional piece of paper. So the vanishing points are going to be on either side of our key corner. And what we'll do, just for the sake of moving it in a certain view shed here, we're going to have the left point a little bit closer now as demonstration, and the right point a little bit farther away. So the rule is vanishing points, the left vanishing point and the right vanishing point are always on the horizon line. And we already know the horizon line is always where our eyes are physically, not where we're looking, where they are relative to the earth. So if you're standing on land, the horizon might be out to a great sea, a great lake, great desert that's flat out to your eye height, or all of a sudden there's nothing beyond that because of the curvature of the earth. So now for this idea of how to project, we're going to take the top of the cube and vanish it back to the left point, and the bottom of the cube and vanish it back to the left point. So that begins to show this left side, and you'll see in a second how dramatic we could make it, because now we're going to come over to the right point and vanish to the right point and vanish to the right point. And I always tell my students that it's best when you're drawing is don't think of being all finger oriented, because you want to move from here to here as technically as possible. So make sure you use your arm and your shoulder to draw a longer line in one stroke. Don't try to draw it out with pencil point. Move it by the whole body and make the whole pencil move with you. And there are no mistakes. There's no erasing. So our next point is the ability now to see a cubic volume in space. So I think right now you have the skill to draw the right side of this, the back corner, in correct proportion to make this side appear square in space, because we have the ability to see 3-dimensional objects in their pure platonic shape in space. So for instance, I believe it's right about here, because if I went too far down here, it would be a long horizontal rectangle. If I came closer, it would be a tall, thin rectangle. So somewhere right about in here with a 5% margin of error, I'm going to drop that vertical line down, and that's the right side of my cube. Same is true on the other side, but this point is closer now. So now the line will be closer to our original corner, right about there. And so now in about 2 or 3 minutes time, we've created not just the space between people, we've created a form on this base plane that sits on a piece of paper, which it can't do. It just appears 3-dimensional instead of actually being 3-dimensional. And that's the power of perspective. And the 2 key points to draw it are the horizon line and the vanishing points. Our third step is value. Because if this 3D dot camera wasn't on right now, the light of it, we wouldn't see this. So you don't see architecture, you don't see anything unless there's light. And light has three principles in terms of how it performs with the volume. So we can break our value down to 3 points over here. There is the light source. There is the shade, which doesn't receive the light source. And then there's the shadow, which is cast by the object. If you use all these three in concert, you end up with a 3D sketch of an object on a two-dimensional plane. So let's investigate light, shade, and shadow on our cube here. As you can see, just from the throw of this dot camera's light, that this side receives the most light. So that's our light side. This is the shade side, doesn't receive direct light, and yet it's casting a very dark shadow behind it. So we're going to do the same thing here with our cubic volume that we've drawn so far. So the first is leave this white and make this side gray. So now, rather than using the point of the pencil, kind of go on the edge of it and just sort of wash in a tone of gray across the whole left side. So now the shade side, and now this seems to be, image-wise, a bit more three-dimensional than just the lines were. Because really we don't see lines in space, we see light and volume in space. And that's a key point with the Parthenon we're going to get to in a couple of minutes. So we've accomplished the light side by not doing anything. We've just drawn our shade side. Now I want to throw a shadow onto this ground plane because this is a plane in space. This is a plane, this is a volume in space. But now with our horizon line, this is actually a plane in space too, the whole ground plane. So if our source of light comes, and let's assume it's the sun on this cubic volume, it would come down in some view over here and cast a shadow to an angle coming off of that. And then because the top of this receives the sun, that casts a shadow, and that goes back shadow-wise to our left vanishing point. After a certain point behind it, coming off the right vanishing point, that shadow ends and gets cut off. So now we can go a little bit darker with the cast shadow. So that third step here within the value creates yet an even greater sense of the quality of what value can do for the space that we're trying to work with here, the planes that create the volume on top of the space. So now we can enrich this really quickly by assuming that both of our people are also in that sun's value. So we can say on one side of them, underneath their jacket and then thrown on the ground, is their cast shadow. One side, underneath their jacket, and then cast down too. So now they stand on the ground plane a little bit more. We can then add to this and create more of a spectacle of the cube itself and say it's actually on a building site. It's got an area or zone where it's allowed to exist in space. So going back, if it's a parallel line to any of the cube you've done, which most sites are, you can come off of this plane, and that might come over and meet from this point, and that's the edge of what the land is for that particular piece of property. The edge over here is coming off the left vanishing point and ends right there. So now that's the property, which you might want to then say, well, we're going to have a certain tone for that landscape that the little cubic volume sits on. And so those three ideas, 1, 2, and 3, are always the embodiment of how you add to this particular composition. So just to finish this off, the idea of light, shade, and value, and this is why I expect ideas having a black Prismacolor, a black color pencil, because most pencils, the lead is either way too hard, or if it's really soft, it gets too chalky, it mushes around on the paper too much. So our goal here over a spectrum of value is to say I can leave the paper white, or I can very lightly use the pencil and then add more pressure and add more pressure and add more pressure until I actually am just coal black at the end. So in any given sketch, you want to be able to have a certain percentage of page white left over and a certain percentage of absolute black. And that's how the eye sees form in space, by the highlights of what's dark and what's light. So to finish this little 8-minute sketch in composition here, we're going to add a little bit more level of information. And so what we'll do is we'll add some landscape to it. So I'm going to assume that there's a tree on this corner adjacent to that corner, and a tree in the backyard adjacent to that corner, and then maybe some way back on the horizon line, the distance that might run beyond us this way. And because they're vegetation, a lot of times the deep greens, the deep richness of nature is bolder and darker than the lighter stones and finishes of architecture. We can give those an immediate darker value than the building, just washing those with tone. And then we want to step those down to the horizon line in the distance so they can have a little footing on the land. And then same is true for the trees proper. Now, my take for you now is looking at this. If we come up to the edge here where the dark hits the light and make the dark a little bit darker at the underside of that tree, and the dark a little bit darker when it comes and hits the edge of our cube. Now there's a little bit more of an illusion. When you look at the image you've sketched so far, the one that's on the sheet here, doesn't it seem that the white right here is brighter than the white of the paper on the rest of the sheet? And that's because you create that relationship between the dark and the light. And that spectacle draws the eye's attention to it. The vanishing points draw our eye from this corner point back in distance because we're moving in space dimensionally. And that's kind of the prose and poetry of drawing in 3 dimensions to create that idea of movement. That's all the rules are for perspective. Obviously, there's subsets and ideas for multiplicity of shape, but most architecture is orthogonal and deals pretty robustly in the X, Y, and Z planes. So we're going to move from something this simplistic to something much more complex, and yet it simply is very cubic in space as we set it up, and we use the same principles to move along there. So now we can return to the sheet that hopefully you printed out. And this is a nice reference point to talk about the reason of why we would start with the Parthenon as a subject matter to talk about draw along lecture. And you can start anywhere in time because, again, architecture is all related to its the brethren of things throughout history in terms of how one form generates another and ideas are shared. But this one, obviously, we all know about because probably with the exception of the Great Pyramids in Egypt, the Parthenon of Athens receives probably the most attention over the years from archaeologists, historians, designers, architects, painters, and poets. Everybody has heard about the Parthenon, and we're going to kind of explain why it's so important and what its language is as we draw it out. So this lecture is a bit about drawing as well as the history of this great sort of sacred piece of geometry on the Acropolis in Athens. So we're going to do first, to kind of make sense of all the little tick marks I've left for you to kind of build this out, is we're going to establish our horizon line. And so what we see here in terms of what we do with the cube is we're seeing the top of the cube, so to speak, by this large horizontal line up here. So you sense that we're still within a box that's coming down to vanishing points. And you're going to have to remember where those vanishing points are because you're going to use them periodically in the sketch. And I wanted to draw the building large enough to detail it. So you're going to see that those lines now are actually going to be going down to a horizon line and meet at a point off the page. Here I drew this small enough so that you could see the right vanishing point and left vanishing point. In this case, when we draw the Parthenon, they're going to be off your page. So if you get a little lost or can't find out where it actually meets the horizon line, you can actually add a piece of paper to your right or left and draw that down until they do meet. I have the ability to see it now very easily and always draw the lines together. If you're more novel to this, it might help to draw the lines out on a secondary piece of paper either side so you know where you're drawing your horizontal lines to. Because whether it's the Parthenon, whether it's on the Esplanade in downtown Washington, D.C., some classical building, whether it's a Renaissance building, it could be your neighbor's house next door. If it's orthogonal, it plays by the same rules. Left vanishing point, right vanishing point, horizon line. So backtracking now, here is the top of what I'll show you in the model first, which is the stone basin for the Parthenon. And you can see it still comes up to a point. So as you walk up to the Parthenon, the height of an individual is still well beneath the stairs that lead up to the base of the Parthenon. So this model then, from the point we're going to draw it in terms of a reference, if I set this up, tilt it in the camera's view, we're sort of approaching it from just about this corner as we rise up from the base of the Acropolis Hill, up the stairs of the Parthenon to the base of the columns, which then rocket up to their enormous height on the scale of this building, to its perfection of Greek classical architecture. And rather than be cubic, equal front and back, it's actually a 4:9 ratio. There are 8 columns in the front and 17 on the side, which is very close to 4:9. And that was a sacred relationship to the Greeks in much of their architecture. And we'll talk about that more later, how the spirit of number, whether it's geometric or whether it's mathematical, is they're in concert with each other with all the language of these, which kind of deifies the architecture, takes it up into the gods, and it releases man from making choices if you simply follow nature and what the gods have sort of ordered society through the language of mathematics. And so we'll pull apart some of those details as we draw into this. And there's 2 ways to think of the Parthenon too, is we could draw it as it was intended. So this is a model of the form complete. But as you know, the Parthenon is from 438 BCE, so it's a very old building, and very old buildings don't really survive contemporary changes in politics and society. So its current performance is really more as in its ruinous state after it's changed from multiple uses over the course of centuries. And so we'll take a look at it in its ruinous state to show how it looks today, although we'll talk about how it performed in its original state. And we'll be drawing it as the sun rises on the southeast corner. Because just like the presence of light here from the dot camera shows, we need to show the shade side, the sun side, the volume behind it. And you can see just from this light, we want to get to the cast shadow as well, and then shadows within the building behind the actual frontispiece here. So we use the same values we did in the cube to pull this cubic volume off the paper too. So to give a place for this really quick, I did a really quick sketch of how it stands and how it's surrounded by other things on the Acropolis, just to give you an awareness of where this sits and how we're going to approach it. This is kind of a quick sketch of just the key players that are on there. As you make your way from the city of Athens or the basin down below, this is sort of a truncated mountaintop that overlooks the sea. You'll come through the Propylaea, which is the gateway, which receives people. Over to your right, quickly in model form, is the Temple of Athena Nike, which also uses the same classical language. Off to your left over here is the Requiem. Again, a different type of composition of the classical language we see on the site of the Acropolis. And obviously, the view we have when you reach the Propylaea is a diagonal view across, because the Greeks are very much about the order of volume and movement around the pieces and through them, and not just the static idea of being central on the axis to it. So it's very intentional that you approach the Parthenon to see a key corner. No matter which corner you're approaching from, they're all identical, but it's meant to be seen in space and volume. So this mount, this Acropolis, the Greek root of acro means high, and the Acropolis is then the high city, because polis is city. So it is a high city to honor the gods at the time. And the temple itself is really considered to be the culmination of Doric order. And you probably have heard of different types of classical orders. There's the Doric, which is more masculine, typically has about a 6:1 ratio of its width to its height. The Ionic, which is the more feminine, is closer to 7:1. And finally, the Corinthian is sort of the colossal order, which has the broadest 9 or 10:1 ratio of its width to its height. So this is the sort of penultimate Doric temple that was designed by Greek society at the time. And the Parthenon then was the center for religious life in the Greek city-state of Athens. Pericles ordered the design and construction following the sack of the Acropolis during the Greco-Persian Wars, about 490 BCE. And the 3 buildings you talked about on the site there's also ancillary buildings too. And right now it is sort of a open museum to Greek culture. and various states of restoration. We'll talk about that process later on. Okay, so let's talk about the building then and how we're going to set this up. A Greek temple is coming from, so they romanticized the idea of why is it this construction system of columns and then a horizontal member and a pediment. It can be simply done, if I use a little scratch paper here, as, oops, do something a little whiter. As the notion of a primitive man and what the first most sort of primary idea of construction was in architecture. And some people wrote treatises on this in the 19th century, but the idea is after a storm, you might be left in a forest with a series of trees that got somehow decapitated, lost their branches, and so you've got some major vertical structure on the earth for support. And so the caveman would leave his dank and dusky one-entry type of housing, habitation, and want the fresh air and ability to see in 360 for his own personal defense, and moves outside and sees these as a way of building off the ground and creating interior space. So some of the debris and larger branches on the ground then became the lintel or the horizontal element, which then creates the structure of interiority. If you put a simple roof on this, it's tough for the water and or snow to come off of the roof. So then smaller branches then came and created a pitch, which then would drive the elements off of that. And so now what we have then are the three principal forms called the trabeation of the Greek or Roman classical antiquities of structure. And that is 1, the column, 2, the entablature or the beam, and then 3, the pediment. And centuries left us then with the greatest story of this trabeation of the classical orders, and probably the most replicated over time. We'll see that at the very end of our hour together in the form of the Parthenon here. The Doric column, the entablature, the pediment up above, and the pitched roof to have the waters run off so you keep a nice clean interior space. So even though it suffered damage over the centuries, lost most of its sculpture, its basic structure is still intact. So there's a colonnade, which is 8-fold over here. And so what we're going to do is come back and draw the box really quick. So the corner here comes down and meets this edge, and then drops down to a point where our stairs flatten out to a point right about here, which is the eye height of somebody walking up to the Parthenon. So that's the stairs stepping down. Then anything beneath this line will vanish up to that right point. So the 1 or 2 large, huge scaled stairs that come beneath it will actually make their move up to a vanishing point and up to a vanishing point. They'll turn the corner here and go up to a vanishing point and up to the left vanishing point. So then the ones that are left for our walk on the way up work like that to create this enormous plinth that it separates even terra firma. So if this is the top of the Acropolis, they lift you off the ground because you're no longer in an earthly commission when you walk up to the Parthenon. You're going into the heavenly spiritual space of Athena here as the goddess of war. So then there's a certain point where our cubic volume here comes over and ends, and I've pre-drawn that for you to make sure it's scaled appropriately on your paper. But it's the same language as our cube we did, is that's going to come down and meet all these horizontal lines at a point on the horizon line. So we'll just mark that really quickly to make sure you reference it on both sides. Now the system for a temple, and this isn't as if this was invented for this one site. The Parthenon is a maturation of these ideas over many, many, many temples, scattered throughout Greek and pre-Greek colonies of ideas, originally in wood, and some of the sculpture ideas up here, some historians believe are symbols of the old wooden rafters that would show the ends of the wood here, the timbered, and so some of the details show up in that in terms of the architrave that we'll see later. So our point of reference now in terms of how this breaks into its pieces, at the top of all these tick marks that I've drawn here is the base of that beam that we talked about with the trees and the woods. and then that comes back on this side as well to a point right about there. So vanishing back to the left point, vanishing to the right point, here is our big entablature, which has various elements inside of it where they substrates of ideas. And then on top of that, we'll kind of fill this in really quickly and lightly because this is broken down to how it exists today as a ruin. So we're going to have this angle of the pediment come out and have this one come over and meet it. And that will come down right down the middle between the two center columns here. So the trabeation is the Doric order with the architrave, the entablature, and then finally the pediment up above. Are the three elements that are just formally part of this great classical device, which obviously moved to the Roman Empire as well, came back in the Renaissance. That's the key word for the Renaissance, is rebirth. That's a Latin base for that word. Rest of Europe and eventually the Western Hemisphere and parts of the Eastern Hemisphere as well. The classical is reborn in the 1450s and finds itself reborn again in the 19th century under neoclassicism, born again in postmodernism across the world in the 1980s and 1990s. And it has this particular building where sort of presence among so many people globally is because it's not a symbol necessarily of just Greek culture, because it's really identified with the human being themselves. So before we draw the columns in, the 8x17 pad here, I'm going to go back one more time in the scratch sheet and show an idea about why the column exists as it does. So if this is the base, and that's the foot that you want to have a column lay on, you can draw the reference of a Greek Doric column, and that's basically, it is, if this is x, this is 6x, a 6-to-1 ratio. And so we talked about then the Ionic would be 7-to-1, and so that's the male figure, and that's the female figure. And you can try this out after our hour's up. You can take off your shoe, and you can measure on your foot as it comes to your toes here. You want to measure from your heel to your middle toe. That is your X. So how many inches is your X? And then measure from the ground to the top of your head. Most men globally, no matter what race, have a 6-to-1 ratio thereabouts, 5-to-5 to 6.5. Most women are 6-to-5 to 7.5. So there, in a sense, it's more grace and elegance and more stature. Go taller with the same type of scale beneath, making them a more elegant type of form of nature. So they're identifying the strength of their columns with the human figure. So they're taking something that was given to them by their god or gods, and then from there they've got a device of capital play, the head of it, and then they'll do systems of making it read better in three-dimensional space by using fluting, so it actually holds the light, because if you do a sheer cut of stone around it, it disappears and becomes flat and two-dimensional. If you see periodic shadows cut by the fluting around it, this kind of idea and plan where it cups all the way around, it will seem more like a three-dimensional object in space. So that's the definition of what we're going to go back to now and start to draw as we move from our corner column, which anchors our edge here. So go from tick mark to tick mark. Okay. Then there's going to be a little bit of a gap between the corner column and the first of 16 marching down the side here. And a little bit of a gap between that one and the next one. And all of a sudden, our perspective forces the columns to almost be on top of each other. Now, since we are drawing this in ruinous state, I'll come over to this side. Here's our corner we're drawing it from. And here's part of the damage from the explosion that happened in the 1450s. This was actually an arsenal. And when the Venetians and the Turks were at war, cannon fire came in here and exploded the whole roof off, and there was a massive fire, and they lost the bulk of the history of the Parthenon in one blow that evening. And that's where the basic form of it today kind of stands. And as we march down here, we won't see the space between the columns. We'll just see the column edges themselves marching down, so that we'll see 15 in a row, and then add the 2 corner columns. It's 8 by 17 going back. And that's not sort of an idea just for the Parthenon. It's for all Greek temples, that if you do a 4 style, it has to be a certain number depth. If you do a 6 style, a certain number depth, 13, or an 8 style, 17 deep. And that way you're always close to the 4:9 ratio. And again, turn the corner, we come up to its large entablature that runs the whole length. We'll see that that'll be cut away in some things here. So we'll pull that line out in a second when we complete that. The entire roof is missing, obviously, from all the years, but there are some relics of the floor plan that are inside of that, as we see the key chamber on the inside is to house the statue of the Greek goddess Athena. So at the front, we're going to come back and bring in some sky later to eliminate that part of the frieze. So what happens up top is this is truncated, as you can see here. So that's just going to scoop back. This one's truncated as well, so it's all sky up to that point. So let's come to the frontispiece now, facing east, and we'll find that we have one column coming right about here, and then a large space. The next column comes down into its space. The next column. So you're connecting those 2 together, and then finding the last one's on the corner, so those 2 are almost adjacent to each other, very little space between them. So what we have in terms of the numbers, we're correct with an 8 by 17. Again, this is just a sketch, so it's not meant to be a precise drafted image. It kind of provokes the idea and the presence of the Parthenon. What we want to do is kind of create this idea of it being more volumetrically as soon as possible. So we're going to use light, shade, and shadow to kind of play with that, and not delineate it too much, but just do it by the play of what we learned about how to make this cube seem more volumetrically impressive on the sheet of white paper. So what's going to happen here is light will come down and light our front side here. And when it hits the actual top of the entablature, it's going to cast a shadow on all the columns. And the idea typically then would be have that shadow come down and just sort of lay on the column. But what happens when a shadow comes down and lays on something that's curvilinear, and it's actually a circle in plan, the shadow line actually curves as well. In this case, it's a sort of a change in the movement where the height of that line then comes down and bows down on both sides. So we're going to come down and bow that line on all the columns as you march across the facade. It's sort of a parabolic shape, not a pure circle. And it simply then takes the shadow cast by the column capitals above and throws it over something that's moving in space in both directions here. So to show that kind of presence of how that's going to move, we're simply going to take a light tone and cover up that part of that volume first. Now what happens on the south side, we could say that it's all lit by the eastern rise of the sun and a bit of the south, but we'll make this more dominant. We'll do the same thing over here, but it'll come to a less of a degree because the sun is stronger on this side first thing in the morning. So we're going to take those along our close columns on this side and wrap those down and back. And then we skip a space where the damage took out the architrave there and the entablature. So that'll come back to here and there, there. Then so what happens in a typical sketch is we're going to spend the bulk of our details, we finish this toward the end of the hour, on the part of the building that's closest to us, and we're going to eliminate as much detail as you move away from it. Because once the eye understands this is a sketch, you show them part of the idea of where you're heading, and then the brain and the imagination will infill the same amount of detail the rest of the building without having to draw that. Plus, this is so far away A good thing to remember when you sit down and sketch live in something, if you're looking at this corner of the Parthenon, you're this close to it, if you're staring at this column, this is really in your peripheral view. You can't see detail down here. You'd have to turn your head and look there. So if you turn your head and look there, then draw that as your sketch. You're not allowed to draw this in the sketch format and still be able to do the detail over there. So let the information dissipate as you move outside the actual core part of your structure there. Okay, so here's a nice part. If we are doing the building complete, we wouldn't be able to see much into there because it's all closed off space by the cella on the inside, the chamber that holds Athena. What we can in our ruinous state is we can see through to the back wall between the columns. I don't know if it's going to do that through the photograph or the model being projected by the dock cam, but you'll see it when we get to the idea that this column corner of the temple, when it rises up, and then this column corner of the temple rises up, they're on the same plane. Even though this is vanishing away, this one seems taller, they're the same height off the ground. So this corner has to vanish back to our left vanishing point. So this line and this line are parallel in space. So now I can bring those back and kind of do a little projection of a line that goes all the way through the temple, back to our left space. And now wherever it's seen between columns, the first time I see it is here, and then there, and then there, and then there, there. Now all of a sudden, I can see the other wall of columns through this front wall of columns. So now I've created a volume of the interior that's seen in the demolition type of site of what the Parthenon is today. So you can actually see more of the volume than you could in its original state. So we'll use that as a reference to kind of build out the rest of the sketch here a little bit. Now, when it comes to the front here, this is in a deleterious space because of all the different types of changes through societal pressures over time. So is the actual groundscape around here, because some of the bits that were blown off of it are still just laying adjacent to it. And they're trying to codify all those and see where they were. They're starting to put pieces back if it makes sense. They'll leave others in a ruinous state if that's a better sort of solution for it. But this isn't organized like it looks in nice clean lines. It really is a whole series of interspersed type of stone debris. So we're going to make that a little more chaotic, kind of at will here, to make it seem like you're walking among a garden of ruins here and not the perfect temple type that it existed as for hundreds of years. And that'll kind of set up a language for us to kind of finish the sketch later on. Okay, the next thing then is when I drew the top of the temple type here, it has a flat piece at the head for all the Doric order here that runs across. Turns the corner and does the same thing over here. And then as that goes back underneath the temple type, turns the corner, this will go back to the left vanishing point, these will go back to the right vanishing point because they're horizontal lines. And that kind of gives us the head or the crown of the column capital. Now we see then the depth of the stone, which is being carried by the columns. So these are the carrying element, these are the columns, this is the beam. And so the spacing here was again based on a language of geometry we'll look at in a second when I sort of do a study sketch of just the elevation. But it's also based on what stone can do physically. Because stone is wonderful in compression. If this was made of stone, it'd be very difficult for me to crush it. But if I took a long piece of stone, you could break it fairly easily by putting weight right in the center of the long piece. So it has no tensile capability. So the distance between the center of the columns are really fairly tight. And it wasn't until some Roman innovations later that eventually took generations before early iron products would expand the language of architecture. Because now we can have buildings that can span from these two columns in width, because we know steel can do that, but stone can't do that by itself. It would shear right in the middle. But it's on the underside, so we can come back to this whole zone here of the entablature and make sure that's a shade side too that doesn't receive light. And then I'll go around the corner. A little bit there too. And so that gives kind of some mass, and there's actually some weight on these columns here. And then because the sun is coming from one side of the column stronger than the other, we're going to assume that the right side, well, maybe we can assume it's the left side, sees a little bit left light. We'll make it more pure early morning, and so we can come and make a little bit of dance of shade on this side of every column in the front. So the sun's starting to hit this side. We're going to make that our light. We want to make sure we've got all of our shade side taken care of. And so it's going to come to this corner, light up the whole entablature, light up the pediment above, what's left of it. So when it hits this corner, this is no longer receiving sunlight. This is still too early in the morning, so that from this whole side, and I think the entablature breaks off at the fifth column, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is going to break off and tag there. Then it builds up again there. So this line will disappear when we do the sky later on, but this whole side will be like the left side of our cube from a while ago, just in shade. That means the columns are also in shade coming down to the foundation. And this is referred to as a wash of tone, where you're not trying to draw it in, you're simply just trying to do the most bluntest part of the pencil to give an overall value for that side. So that helps right away to create this idea, this corner projecting out at us and having a type of presence to have some weightiness, because our goal would be, this is just a wooden block, this is tons and tons of stone erected high in the air. Because, and this is where we'll get a scale feature here and show you the size of these steps. The size of a human being here, we'll put it in really quick, is probably about this height. So you see the scale of just how large this building is on the site here. These are deceptive because they might read as single steps, but they're actually very physical effort to climb up the base stones to get up to the Acropolis, the Parthenon. So our next step here would be to bring in some of the more dark aspects. And one key idea that happens with all form making in a sketch is to think about the presence of key lines and which lines are more significant than others. And the really quick way to think about that is when you're looking at a volume, the most important lines to create depth are the lines where you can actually hold space behind them. By that I mean, as I push my finger behind this box, my finger disappears. So this line is more powerful than this line because that doesn't hold space. You can't put an object behind that line because it's on the surface of it, whereas this is defining space. So if you remember that language of, is the line defining space, then that needs to go darker. So basically this line is the top between two sensitive materials. So it's a line, but it's not as strong as this line up here because there is the development of moving space behind that part. The moving space up here to the top of the entablature and the little cornice line. That turns the corner, that whole edge. And so we wrap around to the edge of the building and find those key lines to really developing space for us. All the way down to this piece, to here as it raised down to the ground. And that line work there then helps set it up as being something, again, that's coming off the paper and having more stature in terms of its prominence. Now we take that same language into this. So from the top of each column, we drop down the edge of the pieces of columns that are certainly closest to us. Drop those down, drop them down. All the way across the front. And as we move away from our key corner, we're going to become less adamant with the same line weight throughout, because again, you can infer the idea of what's going on, and I'd have to detail it because again, we sort of have a limit to how much time we can spend together on this drawing. So in the actual armature of the building itself, this is an opaque wall. The only opening in the interior chamber was through a doorway here, one that would light then Athena when you came inside. building measures in its 4:9 ratio about 228 feet long and about 101 feet wide, with geometrically divided ratios, which we'll talk about in a little bit. It wasn't until about 300 BC that the Greeks' knowledge of the golden ratio was documented by Euclid in his Elements, and it states that there's a relationship in the parts of things that a straight line is said to have been cut in extreme and mean ratio, as the whole line is to the greater segment, so the greater is to the less. And so I'd like to slow down here as maybe some are catching up with some of the line work here and diagram another idea which relates back to the human figure. So you saw yourself as a Doric column or Ionic column in terms of scale and proportion. Let's now take a look at another system of ideas which relates to some of the language of this golden section that I just mentioned. And that's a simple process of, let's do it over here, of taking a square, which again we can all draw very well, and then manipulating it to create a growth pattern, because the platonic shapes grow out of each other. First, there's the circle that has the oneness. The square is the duality of it, the equal sides to it. So it's sort of the parents of all the others. Equilateral triangle is born from those. And so we'll see how they interrelate here in terms of circle and square by simply taking the box and bisecting it. And then take the middle point and find the bottom of the bottom half. So now we know exactly where that midpoint is because we took it from the point of the two diagonals. So we're using angular, triangular type of aspects to create a center in the square. Now I want you to take from the right edge of the square down to the middle another type of diagonal that comes through here. And imagine now this point at the bottom of the square to be the center of a circle. And the circle's radius is what you just did from this point to that point. And so the radius wants to go all around to create the circle. So drop that down now to start the circle as if it's going to go off in space now and be the center of this point and create that full circle. When it hits this line, the bottom line, that's where I want you to stop. So we're going to come over here from the square with this arc now. The square and the diagonal within a circle create a rectangle. And that's what I mentioned before with Euclid's Elements, where the straight line is said to have been cut into extreme and mean ratio, where the square begets a rectangle. So the square being equal on both sides, that's a 1 and that's a 1, the same distance, the same unit. Now all of a sudden comes to a longer unit over here, which is 1.618, which many of you know is the golden ratio. And it's unsolvable. It repeats and goes on forever. So it's not a definitive thing. It's just a relationship between the parts. And so you wonder, well, I understand how that created that rectangle. So it's a golden ratio. Why is that important to us? Now we have the second sketch, which will sort of show that you've been carrying it around your entire life. What I'd like you to do is take your non-drawing hand and hold out your index finger. So your index finger is going to be something like this. And at a certain point, it joins your other finger, and then it has a little bit of a knuckle, and maybe comes down here and joins your thumb. So within that index finger, you've got a distance from the tip of your pencil, excuse me, your finger to your first knuckle. There's a distance, and we'll call that A. Then from your A to your second knuckle, we're going to call that B. And then from your second knuckle to where it joins your palm, we're going to call that C. And I mentioned before that perspective comes probably from 4th or 5th grade instruction, typically teacher introduced it for the first time in an art class. Many of you had this in high school geometry class, mentioning Pythagoras for the first time. In the relationship of the parts, whether it's mathematic or geometric, this diagram in the human figure, not just found in your finger itself, but in your arm section, your hip down to your ankle, that A is to B as B is to C, the exact same ratio. Different numbers, but that ratio is the same as that ratio. That is the golden ratio found in geometries. So if you start to import those types of languages into the design of the temples, or later on cathedrals, or later on the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, or taking a look at floral aspects, or how corn grows on a stalk, all the elements of nature have some relationship to it. The way animals breed, the Fibonacci series from the Renaissance, it's that higher order of design which allows the Greeks to ratify a system that becomes very, very sort of tool down and device oriented. So that's where we become sort of harmonic with the use of this 1.618. So we'll do a little bit more with the sketch here to kind of do some value, then we'll return to this idea of its meaning and language in terms of those geometries. These refinements, upward curvature of the base, the ends, it seems like I'm drawing straight lines all the time. That's for these in the sketch. Nothing in the building, when you approach it, is actually straight, because they made sort of sculptural changes very minimally to make sure it remains straight from a distance as you approach it, and it seems very rigid. Because if you design it like that, it'll seem poorer or weaker if you address the idea of the certain angles against the sky and have no straight lines and no right angles in the building, no pure right angles. They may look like they're 90 degrees, but they're all kind of nebulous to that point of the actuality of it, creates that type of order and device. So we want it to step away from its base line. So another line that holds space beyond it above our horizon line is our top tier of the stairs that work their way up. Then the stairs drop down over here to the other side. We can put that piece. The stairs drop down here as well. Put that piece in. And now we'll do a little bit of attention to what happens through the columns on the other side. This height from this entablature comes over, and the lower part as well is seen snaking through the backdrop over here. And it's way over. And then we'll pick up along the way one or two of the original columns that wrap around the backside. Some of those also were destroyed in some of the blasts from that one epic time in the 1450s. So we will see, again, some shadowed columns on the north side of the project that don't receive the same light as the frontispiece does here. So the entire inside of the entablature, which is now open to the sky, gets grayed out, as do some of the columns that we see peeking through the frontispiece up here. And that helps then again build more of the mass of the building kind of echoing away as it wraps around the north side of the elevation. When we come to this opening, where these have been kind of staggered in some, and this one drops down the lowest, this one comes back up a bit, but you can see the blast kind of opened up a big hole in the side here in kind of a circular form and took out the majesty of some of the columns. What we'll see coming back now is the way this one returned and went back to our left vanishing point. Now the left one goes back to the right vanishing point. So if we strike a line like this, that should be parallel to a top of our stones over here and eventually diminish. Now we have the line for this pediment over on this side of the building. And that'll show up as an element here, and that's more of a full pediment. So we'll see a little bit of the arc up top there. And that's the little bit of the piece we see in the distance over there. Not a whole lot, it's so far back in the sketch, but at least it kind of solves the whole box and shows a little bit of all four sides here. Okay, our next step as we kind of build up the idea is to talk about some of the sculptures. There are none really here because we'll go through that list of what happened sequentially kind of through the years. But the sculptures were all over the place. They were, obviously, they were sort of sculpted columns, but the entire architrave was full of sculptures. The entire pediment told scenes, whether it was Athena's conquest of the sea god Poseidon, or the Greco-Persian wars, or some kind of pantheistic procession of citizens honoring Athena. Athena herself was depicted as a fully armed woman holding a 6-foot tall statue of the Greek goddess Nike in her right hand and a shield in her left. There were 2 griffins and a sphinx that stood on her helmet and a large snake behind her shield. So when you walked up to this, it wasn't just the form of the architecture, it was a story being told. For anybody who might be illiterate, not everybody read back then, there was oral stories, and so you could see the information in the actual artifact of what Phidias did Epictetus and Callicrates are the ones that are the architects, so to speak. Phidias was the master craftsman who told the story of Greek culture through a sculpture. So what we're going to do next is we're going to sort of articulate a little bit more of the language of the building itself, and we're going to do that kind of with a little enhancement of where we put our final darks to pull this mass off this page here. So we know that when we come down to our corner of stepping down to this edge, this series of stones receives more light than this side. So we need to bring some variety of value up to that edge, and that'll help sit that corner down. And it isn't as if you're just myopic and say, well, we should do gray there because it's facing south, it doesn't receive the light. You want to sort of blend in gray with dark sometimes because the stones have aged differently. There's grasses growing around them. And so you don't want to be sort of featureless when you start to do value and kind of move it around and change the value. So some of the stones here might cast shadows and just show a varied tone of like what be happening on your way of access to the temple proper. Okay, but so now we're going to kind of pull it off the back now. Remember how we had the cube with the trees behind that showed just how brilliant the building was with its backdrop. Usually there's a great blue, incredible Greek sky behind all these great white sculptures. And so we're going to use that blue not as a bright color, but as a tone to show some dark next to our sort of column line here. So we're going to take a walk. Just going to take itself on the side of the pencil and bring it all the way down to eliminate the extra lines I was drawing here for the pediment, and bring it down to the ground. And then take it through the columns a little bit. That had sky behind it, not the entire way because the sky can change in tone and value. Put some through here a little bit up to this one, just so we have a little bit of variety in tone adjacent to the stonework here. And we'll probably just leave it over here on the right side of the sketch. So the sky is never the same hue. As a matter of fact, the blue is probably always strongest and deeper above us. As it comes down the horizon line, it gets lighter. We're going to flip that just because we want to have the presence of this edge coming off the paper a little bit stronger. So do the same thing again, kind of layer it in there. And now I think you can see the same effect it had before. As we go darker and darker toward this edge, the stone becomes whiter and whiter. So that again, this stone seems brighter than the paper was over here that we started with. So it might be an approaching storm. It might be the idea of the setting sun later on if this is the west side. But you can always use the value of nature around your subject to create some type of interest level of value around it. So maybe the storm or the clouds come over here and they wrap around this side, and so we can set that edge of the column of the back target off the site too. And that helps kind of pull that apart too. We'll come to the edge of these columns and maybe do our same line for the ones that are closest to us. And then dissipate that, don't take it all the way to the back. And now it's a really key aspect to go back to the middle part of our sketch, because we've kind of drawn the whole sketch somewhat evenly, and focus more and more on this section because we're closest to this, and that's where we're going to have most of our attention. So we're going to come up to this sequence. We're going to split the two parts of the entablature. They have two horizontal elements here. Then above the columns, they've got the notion of the triglyphs, which rise above each of the columns, representing the old wooden piers that would come through there, and then the in-between elements. And that wraps around the corner for each column over here. That kind of indicates the idea and hinting of what the language is up there. Then we have the break and the cornice line, which actually cast shadow. That's all the statuary there. We'll talk about that in a second why. But then on the corner columns, we're going to do a little bit of detail, which will help kind of project the idea of what's still intact here. And that's the fact the columns are fluted. And I mentioned that before, that they're not just a sheer cut stone, they actually have that cut into it. So if you take a nice fine line And that's why I'd ask you to get several of these, because then you don't have to sharpen when you're doing the actual sketch itself. But sometimes you have to go back and sharpen again. And come back in and show a little attention, certainly on the shade side of those lines of the columns that are closest to us. You don't want to wrap around the entire thing, that'll flatten it out. So you want to have the brightness is so bright, it kind of washes out the idea of the volutes. But in this case, we'll keep them dark on the left side, then stop doing them at the second column. Do them again over here, and then stop again, maybe one or two there. And that's probably enough, because once the idea is established, in your mind's eye, you're going to say, oh, they're all fluted like that, and you don't have to spend time doing all that information. It'll help out. So if I could just do one more reference back to how this idea of the diagramming worked. It's a matter of playing with that diagonal in the golden section. So if we were to start with the square again, right? And then that square develops its projection to make it a golden rectangle. So this square with its midsection has its arc that comes down and creates that. This now golden section is also part of an earlier square that created it, which creates a golden section. This golden section is now part of a square that goes this way. This one goes to square this way. So what you see is something that's spiraling out. So nature's spiral is also tied to the sequencing of the golden section growing. So when we take this part of it out, this larger scale that develops along there, we can see with the breakdown of going smaller into this, because now we've got going down into the spiral, we've got that square, and then we have this square, and then we have that square. Those lines indicate for us across the Parthenon, that's the pediment's height. It stops at that point in the growth of the golden section. And over here to here shows the sequence of how the columns interact with the entablature holding up the pediment. And then right from there at the base, beyond that, because that can change height per site, the golden section for a temple, but the overall extent of how this is and the spacing of the columns has to end precisely on that 1.68 to the heights of the columns over here, which is 1. So it's not as if this is just conjecture. This is also systematically based on something as simple as the human figure, or your dimensions between from your hip bone to your knee is 1.618, from your knee to your ankle is 1 then. And so it's basically taken out of the hands of the actual designers and done something more spiritually sensational in terms of the mathematics of it. So now historically, if we'll kind of switch back to the actual figure here of the temple type, it's the sculptures were removed when the building was converted to a Byzantine church, because obviously the deity changed, and so you had iconography for the Byzantine. That was the first change. Second structural alterations was it became a Roman Catholic cathedral. So again, the language of the temple had to change in terms of how it was used on the site on the Acropolis. As I mentioned before, the Turks seized the Acropolis in 1458 and turned the Parthenon into a mosque. Then during the bombardment in the Acropolis by the Venetians fighting the Turks, the powder magazine located in the temple blew up, destroying the center of the building, hence this model. Then some of those deleterious stuff happened after that. The fifth kind of major aspect to it was in 1801, the sculpture that was on the temple at the time, again claiming every skin and surface of it, was removed by a British nobleman named Thomas Bruce Lord Elgin, referred to now as the Elgin Marbles, and they're in the British Museum in London. After centuries of rules, they'll find a sixth adaptation. The Turks and the Greeks finally fought for independence in the 1820s, and the Greeks then, in the mid-1900s, post-World War II, they began a multi-decade restoration project, and they're still in the midst of that. what you know about this and its impact around the world, you can't walk across your hometown and not see a classical elevation on a civic building, on a bank building, something of prominence. Just culturally quick through the array of models here. Here's a Roman temple that's in full situ in the southern part of France, called the Temple Carré, Maison Carrée. The Romans obviously identified with it. In the Renaissance through the Baroque, this is the Parthenon in Paris, and so there's its temple front in the front section of its cruciform plan underneath its major dome. Eventually, Napoleon himself rebuilds the Parthenon, initially as a great railway station. Eventually, though, when Napoleon is deposed, ends up being a Catholic church, and that's in the center of Paris off the Place de la Concorde. Shifting over to America, we've got temple types, again, back in Washington, D.C. on the green there. This is the temple to our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, post-Civil War, built in the 1930s. And even looking at money stock around the world, here's how the Americans celebrate the language of classical architecture with the White House, with its temple front. So it's a very fluid type of cultural aspect across the planet, and has a lot of spectacle to it. And I hope you've had some sense of repose drawing this. I know it's a lot in a short time, but this is the process that I've been doing for many years, teaching students the content of it by having the students draw it. And that's what I believe is a higher level of learning, because there's a certain impact, which I'm sure you've heard about through many different types of essays about how human beings learn. But if you just listen to somebody talk about something, there's no imagery, it's very hard to retain it. When you see the imagery, it's much better. But if you can communicate something as you're learning, it's even finer. And if it has to be a drawing or a sketch or something that's got that type of motor skill where it's left and right brain, it's remarkable what your brain is going through on that task to try to listen, draw, sketch, and create. And then when you're done, I think it improves your self-esteem if you like what you drew, and it reduces your stress, because drawing just sort of relaxes you and kind of just creates you, it gives you more of a humanistic view of the world to do something as a human as you're learning there. And then once you start doing your own sketches on your own subject, it's a way to express yourself. And so this is how you would have seen the Parthenon, or what you wanted to do in terms of you being on the site, and kind of has that going for it too. I think it's a remarkable way to learn if you can stick with it. It's a great experiential system to tax yourself that way. It's a skill set you have to pick up. But quite frankly, as a species, we drew before we had language. In the caves of Lascaux and all the caves you're finding middle of Spain as well, there are markings of tens of thousands of years ago. People were drawing things really articulately before they had speech, a really working language. So we were meant to draw. And it's something we've gotten away to kind of culturally, even more so now with the digital age. So I encourage you to pick up the pencil and go to a blank piece of paper, find that horizon line, and sit down and sketch. Thanks for joining me today. If there are any questions, Heather will take those now.
Thank you very much, Professor Keane. We have a few questions come in. So our first one here is from Warren in Northfield in the United States. And he says, how did you get into this way of lecturing? I think it's fascinating.
Well, I think it came to me when I heard a lot of architecture students who had selected their career coming out of high school that they hadn't drawn at all in high school. That basically in the American system of education, every student takes art every day of their lives until about third or fourth grade. Then it becomes more of an elective. Then it becomes something where it's less even advantageous to be in the school systems. So our profession started to lose that ability to think with a pencil. So I started to take all the freshmen every year, the hundreds we have in one class, and simply make them not just take notes from my lectures, but have the notes be written and typed out somewhere they can download, have them draw the idea. And that way, rather than having to go back and look what the text was about, they could sit down the next day and draw the idea of what was important instead of trying to regurgitate text. And so we found more success with student retainment, about their self-identity, about a skill set they didn't know they had, because we all have this. It may be a foreign language to you now, but when you started doing your first foreign language, you weren't very good the first day. But after a couple months of practicing with it, you've got a skill set, and that's what drawing is.
Excellent, thank you. Here we have Layla in Sacramento in the United States, and she says, great class, thank you. What's your personal favorite building to draw?
Well, I'll take a note from Frank Lloyd Wright. He got asked the same thing about what his favorite building was, and he always said, my next building. And that's how I feel about this. Is it's such a part of my personal culture, is that it's almost like breathing. If I don't draw for 2 or 3 days in a row, my wife can tell you I get a little tense. I haven't done something right. It's almost like I lost my fresh air. So even if it's a 5-minute sketch, a doodle, a drawing for a client, whatever it is, if I can make marks on a piece of paper, I'm better just on multiple levels. And so that's what really kind of pushes me along, is the next thing I draw.
Fantastic, thank you. Question here from Jacqueline. She's in Ohio, and she asks, it was fascinating to learn about the perspectives. Could you recommend any good books or guides to get started on drawing for adults?
Yeah, I think you can go to any type of online art store. Like in the States, we have Blix, and Paris, they have Rouge Play. I don't know what the British store is, but they're going to have all the ones that they've kind of scoured through and say, what's a good price point to have the basics and fundamentals? But I also think that's a price point. I also think you can just find this online. There are YouTube tutorials for beginning sketchers. You can find things like that. I think that it's important with the fundamentals I gave you today. You can step out tomorrow and draw something where you live. You don't need more than that in terms of instruction. You just need practice, because the difference between what I do for a living and what you're doing now is just numbers of drawings. I wasn't born with anything different than you were born with. I've just practiced more. This is my foreign language.
Wonderful, thank you. Iris in Reno in the United States says, what do we know about the original architects of the Parthenon? Who actually designed it? And do you think they had an idea at the time that they would create such an iconic building that people would still be drawing thousands of years later?
Oh, well, number one, it's the client always, and that was Pericles. And when Pericles finally created this Greek empire, and he's the leader of it, he had to have a definition to show that heroic element. So Pericles demanded something of this scale and this prominence on top of the Acropolis. So it was the mission of the client. And great architecture comes from great clients. Ictinus and Callicrates probably had an array of Greek temple exposure on other sites. You're basically brought as masons first, and then the architect side to put it together. Architecture back then is nothing like architecture today. So they would have had to have on-site skill sets of working with stone and large timbers. But I think the real genius here was Phidias, because what you really don't see today, unless you go to the Elgin Marbles in London, is all the sculpture. And then you'll see that array there. Another spectacle, which I didn't address today because we had to keep this simple in black and white, is this is a fully polychrome building. It was fully painted and fully patinaed with materials. It's not a white sculpture whatsoever. It was colorful. And we don't see that today because of all the thousands of years of nature and man tearing it down to just the stone itself. So look it up and see how it was actually illustrated by some 19th century illustrators and what they thought it would have looked like when it was full color. Really a spectacle.
Thank you. And a quick question here from Dylan. He's in Montclair, and he says, would it still work to do this, but using coloured pencils or paints perhaps to fill in the building?
Right. So this is where I kind of graduate students, because a lot of times this is the base way to start. I like it better than a straight pencil because you can see the blacks you get. Plus, it stays where you move now. If I did this to a pencil drawing, it would smear. This has got more of a wax base to it, the colored pencil. It's a good tad more expensive than just a number 2 pencil, but worth it. But then the color stuff incrementally makes it a bit more expensive for an introductory class. So I like it that way. But people tend to think that if you move into color, it's much more artful. So we do teach then, certainly after this, the move from black and white colored pencil to colored pencil. And that's pretty simple because architecture is very bland. It's very natural. You get 3 or 4 greens, 3 or 4 browns, some beiges, and some blues, and that's all you need. 12 pencils, and we could do this tomorrow and make it colorful. The next step after that, probably the most efficient way to make really colorful thing for less money, is a nice watercolor set. But then you have to learn how to blend your colors, and you get used to those, and that's pretty fast as well. Then you move into color markers, a little more expensive, but they're very vibrant, and there's no mixing, they're predictable, and that's a lovely way. So not only have I done history of architecture and content, I've also done 7 or 8 media too, various courses, and there's rewards for them all. Sometimes it takes 4 to 8 hours or 16 hours to do a rendering, but more often than not, the real principal tool that I think everybody should have is more like the quick sketch, but certainly can be done in color too, Dylan.
Thank you. And the last question we've probably got time for tonight, this one's from Susie in Norwich. And she says, how different is the experience of drawing a building when you're sat in front of it compared to drawing like this from an image?
You know, it's funny, when I get on the site, and we had a class of students over in Athens, and we took them to the Acropolis, and we all hit the Acropolis, and they're following me around, because when I walk around a building, I can find what's going to be a better sketch than other things, where they're just sort of overwhelmed by seeing the Parthenon for the first time. They don't know where to sit down. So when you're beginning on a site, it's difficult to say, do I just sit and start drawing? Whereas I can see kind of the final sketch already. It helps to kind of have that saying, well, this is going to give you better light, and this is a better subject matter. But it's just by trial and error. And again, it's a game of numbers. But I really encourage you to go to sites, because these places are absolutely spectacular. These top buildings around the world, what mankind has done, it's just absolutely heroic. It's an incredible field.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Keane. That's been a brilliant session.
Thank you. And then for anybody out there, any questions down the road, just send them to Heather, to company, and they'll post them to me, and maybe I can answer them in more detail for you.